Hello, everyone. My name is Jasper Wilkins, and I'm the Marketing Director at the Aquatic Life Institute. Just want to say thank you to all the panelists so far. It's been a really great conference so far, and I really appreciate also everyone coming to attend. Today, the panel topic is going to be how advocacy groups can better pitch their work to get coverage in the media. Just a few housekeeping rules to get started. So the audience are muted throughout, and you can post questions in the Q&A box or on the Wove app as well. Every session is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. And we want to make sure that everyone is respectful at all times, and we do not accept any harassment or discrimination. So this session is going to be about 65 minutes, and we've got 5 panelists to get through. So I'm really excited to hear their stories and hear what they have to share with everyone. Each panelist will have around 10 minutes, and then the Q&A at the end will last about 15 minutes. So firstly, I'm going to introduce each of them, and then after we'll go one by one, and they'll introduce themselves a bit more and tell us about their work. So firstly, it's going to be Anna Bradley, who is the Executive Director of Sentient Media. Then we're going to speak with Roberto Guerra, who is the Managing Director for the Spanish version of The Economist. Then we're going to speak with Kenny Torrella, who is a Deputy Editor of Future Perfect at Box. Tom Levitt is Commissioning Editor at The Guardian's Animal Farm series. And finally, it's going to be Rob Fletcher, who's a Senior Editor at The Fish Site. So firstly, Anna Bradley, would you like to share your screen and share your story?
Hi. Yes, let me get in here. Can you see that okay? I'm gonna assume yes. Cool. So yes, my name is Anna Bradley, and I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this panel today, and just to be a part of this conference. It's awesome what you all have put together. So yeah, as Jasper said, I'm Anna Bradley, Executive Director of Sentient Media. We're a non-profit journalism organisation, and we focus on creating more transparency around the use of animals by humans. So we place animals at the front and centre because they play this integral but invisible role in our daily lives, from food to makeup, clothes, transport. The scale at which we use animals is mind-boggling. We primarily focus on the food system, and we drill down into a few topic areas: big ag, culture, environment, and justice, as you can see here as a snapshot from our website. The reason we focus on those angles is because, considering how much food we produce and how much we consume, we know, and actually its outsized impact on the earth and on our health, we know relatively little about how our food systems operate. What it means when you buy a $1 burger, or what it really means when a label says cage-free. And one of the reasons we think we don't know about this stuff is because the mainstream media drastically underreports these important stories. Perhaps because reporting the facts about industrial animal agriculture presents this really inconvenient dilemma: either overhaul our current food system, which might take a bit of energy, or just continue to destroy our planet and ourselves. So perhaps it's best to just not talk about it. So we understand how important it is to tell these stories, but the big question is how? How do we get these ideas into mainstream media? How do we shift these outdated narratives? And how do we get this message out into the world? So at Sentient Media, we publish the stories that we think are missing from mainstream media, or from the main kind of conversation that's happening out there. But we also train advocate writers how to get their articles published as part of our growing community we call our Writers Collective. We're currently at about 350, 360 people right now who are going through online training with us. And this slide shows some of the publications that we've helped people get placed in. But in reality, of course, as you know, there is no single answer or any single magical answer to the question of how we get published. And I'm sure we'll hear that echoed by the other panelists today. But what I'm presenting today is definitely not guaranteed to work, and there will always be exceptions to the rules. but we have picked up a few trends based on our experiences of working with our community, which I've basically distilled into top 5 tips, which I'm going to run through now, which I hope will help improve your chances of getting placed. And my first one, number 1, you might not like this one. I don't know if you can quite see the full slide there, but number 1 is no one cares about animals. By which I mean animal suffering isn't always enough. Of course, there are exceptions, but as a general rule, remember around 86% of our population eat animal products on a regular basis. So the chances that an editor is going to get excited by a story of poor animal welfare or animal suffering are likely to be slim. Or perhaps over the years, we might have become a bit desensitized to undercover investigations and, handy, like shaky video footage of animal suffering. So in our experience, it's been hard to get stories placed which focus solely on the exploitation of farmed animals. So my advice, I don't know if it's coming up on the screen here, but my advice is to rethink your angle. Think about how you frame your story, what kind of story you can tell by expanding the frame of reference beyond animal suffering alone. And I have a few examples here. These are from folk in our writers collective. So basically what I want to show you here is a few intriguing leads or intriguing ways to tell these stories. So here, this idea that maps are biased against animals, that was an interesting way to kind of draw in readers. This was published in Wired. And then we have monster movies influence how humans relate to the natural world, another intriguing title. But yeah, studies actually show that what we do care about is our health, our environment, and money. So try and think of angles like that to help tell the stories that you think are important. Find a way in that's different than just the animal suffering. And another angle and another tip, number 2, is tell your story. Tap into your experiences. Here's another example from Ryan Hewling as part of our writers collective. He wrote about his experiences flying with his dog Penny for USA Today. And the tragedy of our companion animals being treated like objects on planes, leading to suffering and sometimes, unfortunately, death. So if you wanted to tell a story that relates to yourself, you could perhaps bring in farmed animal lives by explaining, yes, this is what happens when I fly with my dog, but this is what pigs, cows, sheep go through in hours and weeks in cramped transport, etc. So think about how your lived experiences tie into animal lives and speak from your personal point of view. So in our writers collective, every 2 weeks, we send around this big list of pitching opportunities. As you can imagine, there aren't a lot of pitching opportunities that share, come and write about animals, etc. So what we do is we try and find ways into different stories. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, the roundup included calls for reproductive justice pitches. So you could talk about dairy farming in that. There was one calling for prison stories. So you might want to talk about the need for healthy food in prisons. But yeah, here's a few other examples of articles that we've published, a feminist perspective on a livestock auction, raising vegans, so a parent's experience of raising vegan children. But yeah, I think that trying to tell your story and figuring out how your unique lived experiences can tie into this story is something that we found successful. Number 3, follow the money, follow the power. So stories that investigate corruption and power, they can take a little bit more time to compose, but they have a really high impact. So you might remember this person on the left is Craig Watts, the former poultry farmer. He opened up the doors of his farm to animal rights groups and told this horrific story of debt and a system set up to benefit the few at the expense of farmers and chickens. And this story was covered in the New York Times, Business Insider, a whole host of outlets, and he was even named Whistleblower of the Year. But when it comes to money and power and corruption, as you know, big ag is a rich playing field. So as you formulate these stories, I would say ask yourself, what is the money question? Like, how are these issues impacting businesses or shareholders? Like, would shareholders, for example, the shareholders in Purdue, in Craig's case, what would the shareholder think knowing the truth? What do consumers think? How would they feel? There are a lot of stories, there have been some out today, in fact. There are a lot of stories within animal ag about traceability and labeling. And this is something we always encourage our writers to look at. So this article here from The Guardian on the right, we worked with the investigative company Seed on this to try and frame the story about essentially, this was about spent dairy cows being misleadingly labeled as organic. And this implies a certain level of care and of course a higher paying point. And it's something that obviously draws the attention of the readers, because if you're buying beef that's organic, you want to know that it's had a certain level of care. So finding these ways into telling stories, following the money and the power is certainly something. Yeah, think about who would be outraged if they knew the truth, and angling your story in that kind of way is something that we've found work. And if you don't want to talk about money, then talk about cake. So this is a true, this is a genuine tip. According to this brand new report from the brand new Albert report, which came out in the last couple of months, cake is mentioned 10 times more than climate change on UK television, that is. Here's the summary of the report. But my point here, like, yes, talk about cake, but do your research, find what's trending, be opportunistic and harness news cycles to bring out perspectives that will help people begin to question this invisible suffering, the invisible animal suffering that's in part of their lives. And finally, number 5, I would say, don't be disheartened when editors say no. Do not take it personally and don't stop. Unraveling corruption, shifting narratives in this way, and inciting change on any kind of behavioral or policy level, it takes a lot more than one story. Like, just think about the history of the tobacco industry and the changes that happened there. Think about just the acceptance of climate change, and think about how specific stories of injustice, like the victims of the pharmaceutical industry, you know, the thalidomide babies, the opioid crisis. It's never just one story that changes the world overnight. So keep going and keep investigating and keep pitching. It takes more than just one story to change the world. But the more that we tell these stories in the press and mainstream media, the more likely we are to influence these policies and change the way that we consume in order to protect the future of our own species and the planet and those we share it with. And as I've said, to summarize, there is no silver bullet and there's certainly no single approach. And of course, there will always be exceptions. What I've said here, there will always be exceptions to everything that I've suggested. But if you're interested in learning more and actually communicating with other advocates, I'd encourage you to join and sign up to our Writers Collective. It's free to join. You gain access to a whole load of training and access to mentors. You can see here I've got Kenny, who's going to be speaking in a minute. He shares some great pitches as part of his Pitching 101 lesson. And you can find all of the information on sentientmedia.org or reach out to me directly. That's Anna at sentientmedia.org. But thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your questions at the end.
Thank you, Anna. That was very inspiring. And also, we just want to say we appreciate, sharing our work at ALI. I think it's really important in the movement to build allyships and work together to promote these causes. So next up, we have Roberto Guerra from the Spanish version of The Economist.
All right. Hello. Nice to speak to you. Nice to be here. And thank you all for the invitation. So as Jasper mentioned, I am the managing director for the Spanish version of The Economist, which is the vegan business magazine. And I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about it right here and show you some slides. Actually, first I will, of course, share my screen here and here we are. Boom, boom. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about The Economist here. So The Economist is a German media company. Okay, it was founded in 2018 in Germany. The first version came out in German, of course, and then a few months later, not long after, the English version was created. And then after the English version came out, we had the Spanish version and the French version now. So I'm in charge of the Spanish version here, and here you can see a little bit about it here. So we basically talk about companies that well, you can see basically this is kind of vegan activism through a business perspective, from the business side, because as Anna had mentioned earlier, unfortunately, I also concur that no one cares about animals, or very few people. So the best way to help change the system is basically here through the business side and making vegan products much more easily accessible, and what more easily accessible way to do it than through the business sector. So this is it here. So what does The Economist do, and what is it, who reads The Economist? So basically, the people who read The Economist, the general readers, are of course business people and decision makers. Not everyone is in the vegan sector who reads it. We also have a lot of readers from just major food companies in general, from meat companies, who see a big opportunity in the growing vegan market. So they might want to read The Economist to see what's going on, see some statistics, see, wow, maybe this is worth getting into, and maybe we can shift away from animal products and start, moving towards plant-based foods. So anything that's new, current developments, we report on startups that say they receive a big investment. That's a big one there. Anytime a vegan startup receives an investment, especially a major investment, we want to report on that. We always want to be the first ones to report on that. And then any developments or anything new with a company, for example, how Unilever now has the vegetarian butcher. That's big news for us. The Economist usually tries to stick with the bigger players, which is more attention grabbing and everything, but we also focus on smaller companies as well. So with smaller companies, it might be a little bit more difficult. We also write about trends, market trends. That's also very important, and anything that's relevant to vegan business news. So let's move here. So how can you get published on The Economist? So it's a good question here. So some stuff is pretty much common sense. We want a concise press release, like it says here, ideally around 400 words. It's not a strict number. It doesn't have to be 400 words, like less than 400 words. It can be 600, but as long as it's compelling and if it's concise, something that kind of gets to the point. Because sometimes we get a press release from a company and it sounds more like an advertisement. And the thing is The Economist is a B2B company. So basically, we're trying to speak more with business people and communicate more with business people. But of course, public is we also have a lot of general readers from every sector and just people interested in veganism. But our key target audience is people in the business sector. So sometimes people send press releases and say, this is delicious, and we try to stay away from adjectives that sound too much like publicity and things like that. So that, and then some common sense things here, like be sure to minimize the grammatical errors, and it should be related to the vegan business sector, the news, but it doesn't always have to be that way. If it's a statistic or something that can be that can be of importance, we'll also take information about that, and then we'll add our own business spin to it. But if you can make it relevant to the business sector, that's always much better. And of course, if it's a new company that people aren't very much aware of course, you want to provide the details of the company. When was it founded? Who are the founders? Where? And who is what type of clients? Is it a B2B company? Does it deal with general customers? So a lot of times people send press releases and they don't give those details because readers want to know, because a lot of these readers could be potential investors as well. We like to call them conscious investors, or people who are more interested in investing in environmentally conscious and companies that are better for animals, etc. But not always. Be just looking for a good opportunity, but whatever works, as long as it helps expand the vegan sector, we are happy with that. On to here. Okay, here we go. So here are some additional tips So how can you make this of interest for conscious business people and investors and decision makers? Well, like I said, it doesn't have to be 100%. It's not 100% necessary that it is involved, that it talks about business. Okay, there's also, for example, actually from the Aquatic Life Institute, we've actually gotten some information and we've reported on some things that aren't 100% focused on business, but they do focus on how maybe consumers are more aware of fish sentience, or how the fish sentience movement is actually growing, and how awareness is growing. And then we put a business spin, and we talk about the growing plant-based seafood industry. Not actually seafood, but we still call it the seafood industry, or the cultivated seafood industry. So we can always give a spin on that. So here, let's see, which language platform may be the most adequate. All right, so yeah, you always want to consider that. So we have different languages. Okay, so we have 4 languages. The Economist has 4 languages. So let's say, obviously, if it's something that might be of interest to the German public, you might want to pitch it to the German side. But if it's something that's maybe of interest to the German public, but also that could be interesting for people globally, because this is a global movement, you might want to pitch to the German and the English side. Or you can always send a press release and then ask, can this be in the German side and the English side? Is this a possibility? Because this can pertain to global readers as well as people in Germany, just for example. And then, yeah, but if you're not sure, if you want just like, global readers, of course, English is the default language for the global audience. So that's basically it. Just make sure it's concise and that it's something that is, that is attention grabbing for the public, related to vegan business. And we also do cultivated meat. So anything that's cell-based meat, which the new term is cultivated meat, we don't say cultured meat anymore. So that's basically it. So that's it. So I will be looking forward to any questions that you may have about The Economist, or general questions about getting into the vegan media sphere. And please feel free to contact me or add me here on LinkedIn. This will just be real easy. Roberto Guerra. That picture is don't forget about it. And remember to look for the little forest in the background. And that is all. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Roberto. And just a reminder to everyone that you can use the Q&A button if you have any questions, and we'll get to the questions at the end of all panelists. So next up, we have Kenny Torrella. Would you like to share?
Hi, Jasper. Hi, and thanks to everyone at ALI for having me. So yeah, my name's Kenny Torrella, and I'm a deputy editor at Vox.com in the Future Perfect section, which is our section that focuses on big neglected problems and solutions to address them. And so we look at pandemic risk, AI safety, global health and development, and also factory farming and the future of meat. And so we've written a few stories about fish, and fish welfare is a particular interest of mine. So I'm excited to be here to talk with you all. So before I get into some of my tips, a bit about my background is that before I joined Vox a year ago, I worked at Mercy for Animals and the Humane Society of the United States. So I've had the experiences of both doing communications and PR for animal nonprofits, and then also on the editorial and journalism side of reporting on animal issues, which has given me kind of just an interesting perspective on the issue, because I've both, struggled to get media coverage, but then also had a lot of pitches sent my way and have to be really selective about, what we commission and what we spend our time on. So my first point that I wanted to raise, and I don't have slides, but my first point I wanted to raise is kind of similar to what Anna said, maybe not as blunt, that people don't care about animals, but I will say that getting animal coverage is hard. About 10 years ago and a few years in, after 10 years, there was a lot of coverage around factory farming, undercover investigations, ag-gag laws, cage-free egg policies. And it seemed like the media was really taking an interest in animal agriculture and its effects on society. But then a few years ago, I started to notice that the media really veered in the direction of covering more of the solutions to factory farming, mainly plant-based and cell-based food technology. And that's really been a primary coverage area for the media when it comes to animal ag over the last few years, which has made pitching animal welfare a little harder. And I think when it comes to fish welfare, there's a bit of a paradox going on. So on the one hand, on the harder side, most people don't care about animals, as Anna mentioned, and even fewer people care about fish. And also, at least in the US, Americans don't eat a lot of fish. So fish welfare is just not top of mind for most people, if anyone. So that makes it harder. But one of the things I think pitching fish welfare and issues around fish welfare has going for it is that it's very undercovered. So if you can find the right story and find the right angle, you can break through kind of that barrier of apathy towards fish. So then the question becomes, like, what is a great story about animal welfare and fish welfare, I should say. And so that depends on one, what kind of work you're doing and where you're pitching. A lot of news outlets do a lot of incremental news coverage, which I think is great. They might do a story on a new undercover investigation or a campaign or some kind of commitment from a food company. And then some outlets do more like trend or feature stories, which is what Vox does. So rather than covering, say, every fish investigation that comes out, we might do one piece in a year that looks at what undercover investigations into fish farms have uncovered. So I think first it's important to think about what kind of story are you pitching? Is it incremental or is it more of a trend or feature story? And then I also think an important angle to think about is any kind of challenge to conventional wisdom. And I think there's a lot of incorrect conventional wisdom around fish. The most notable ones are whether fish feel pain or not. And the Guardian, I know Tom Levitt's here, the Guardian has done some great coverage on that question. So there's a lot of incorrect conventional wisdom around fish, both whether they feel pain, whether they're intelligent or not. They have 3-second memories, all those things that we've heard about. So I think if you're not pitching an incremental story, like you conducted an investigation or you have new research to present or some kind of experiment to cover, then challenging conventional wisdom can be appealing to media, especially if you have really strong evidence to back it up. So there's that angle of challenging conventional wisdom around fish welfare, which I think there's a lot of ground to be covered there. And if you do pitch that without, say, a specific report or experiment that you're looking for coverage on, then it's really important to at least bring experts to editors and reporters. I think it can be really helpful to pitch an interesting story idea, but if you don't have people that they can talk to, documents they can look through, that makes the journalist's job a bit harder. So if you can share a full story, an idea along with who to talk to, reports to read, that can really help journalists save time and get to the heart of the story. I also think that if your organization either has scientists on staff or the ability or the funding to fund scientists to do novel research on fish welfare, that can be really useful in trying to get media coverage. Both, that research can advance the field, but it can also help people better understand fish welfare. And I think, as Roberto and Anna mentioned, there's also a way to make it important to people's lives. Again, most people eat fish to a varying degree. So if you can present research that is relevant to people's diets and lives and frame it that way, that can be helpful. I also think another category of story that there's a lot of ground to cover when it comes to fish welfare and not a lot of coverage is picking out like one small idea or one small problem or one small fact in fish farming that tells a bigger story. So one example, and there's been a good amount of stories out there about this issue, but it's something that I'd like to cover in the next few months if possible, is the problem of fish meal and fish oil. I think a lot of you know that a lot of the fish that are caught in the ocean are either fed to farmed fish or used as animal feed ingredients. I think there are a few data points in there that would be really good to unpack for articles. So that's again something to think about when you are thinking about trying to get media coverage. Is what are some interesting statistics or facts about the fishing industry that might make a reader stop and think and click and become interested and tell a larger story. Another area that I think is neglected in the fish welfare reporting, although this is not true for the fish site and Rob, because the fish site covers the fishing industry very well. But at least in terms of larger media, there's not a lot of coverage about the fishing industry and its biggest players and biggest businesses. That's not the case for beef and poultry and for the pig farming industry. We regularly hear about Tyson and Pilgrim's Pride and Cargill in the news, but I don't think most people, even informed, readers and people who care about animal welfare, could name some of the bigger players in the fishing industry, whether it's in their country or global companies. So I think more reporting and pitches around the actual industry could be helpful in helping readers and journalists better understand fish welfare in the industry that affects it. And then I also think it's important in your pitches to just be honest about the trade-offs to increasing fish welfare. I think one mistake that a lot of NGOs make, which is totally reasonable, I understand why they do this, is that they'll just tell their side of the story. But to a journalist who wants to try to see a story from different angles, it's really helpful from the get-go to hear about some of the arguments maybe against your story or against your pitch. That will instantly make a pitch more interesting. Again, it's not something that a lot of NGOs want to do, but I think it can help increase your chances of getting coverage. And of course, the bigged issue here in fish welfare is that, generally, not in all cases, but generally, when you increase animal welfare, there might be costs passed on to the producer and then onto the consumer. And I think it can be helpful in your pitch to kind of front load your pitch with all the nuances of your ideas so that it helps the journalist better understand the issue right off the bat. So I'll stop there. Those are just some of the main tips I have. And to recap some of them, I think fish welfare coverage is hard to get because it just hasn't been covered that much, but that also means that there's a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of ground to cover. So if you can, produce novel research, novel reports, polling, and to better understand this industry and how consumers feel about it, and think about different ways to pitch and approach this issue. You don't just need to do a new undercover investigation or conduct new research. You can also help journalists tell bigger stories about this issue and this industry by just supplying them with research and a way in to talk about fish welfare. Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you, Kenny. That was a really insightful presentation, and I hope the viewers take in and maybe potentially pitch to you or pitch to other media that are out there. So next up, we have Tom Levitt.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
That's good. I haven't got a presentation. I have been listening to what Kenny said. I just missed right at the beginning. So I've got some thoughts, but I think they probably feel better in answer to questions, if that makes sense. Because I feel like some of the answers I give will be similar to Kenny, but maybe just slightly different. And maybe they'll be better coming out, or they'll be repeated in questions. So if there's a chance for someone, if someone else is giving a different point of view now, but then there's a chance for more people to ask questions, then I'd probably suggest that would be better than me kind of repeating some things that Kenny said.
Okay, great. Yeah, what we'll do, we'll go to Rob Fletcher instead, and afterwards we'll speak with you about the questions at the end. So Rob Fletcher, would you like to go ahead?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Animal Life Institute, for organising this event and for inviting me along. And thank you to the other panelists for their good presentation so far. Just reminds what a diverse world the media is for someone who's very much concentrated on aquaculture and the opportunities out there. I'm going to give a brief presentation today, a little bit about I'm senior editor of the Fish Site. We are very much an aquaculture focused. We do a bit of fisheries as well, but not as much as we used to. It's mainly aquaculture based. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can hear that, see that even, and hear me. So Fish Site's been going for, since sort of the early days of the internet, just about. I think it started in 2002. I've been editing it since 2017. Yes, we aim to provide information about research, technologies, techniques, very much trying to promote best practice in the international aquaculture sector. Another element of our work is the aquaculture is, a lot of people think of aquaculture as big business, but actually provides a lot of livelihoods. There's a lot of smallholder farmers out there. And it also, it's not just providing salmon and shrimp for wealthy people. There's a lot of food security that comes alongside aquaculture. So we're very keen to support those ideas, support the people in the sector. We work with a range of organizations, from emerging startups, international development agencies, and leading industry players. Just to give a few insights into our audience. So anyone looking to write for us, this sort of gives you an idea of our target audience. It might give you some ideas of how to pitch it. So yes, we have progressive English speaking farmers who are interested in sustainable production, general farming techniques and innovation. And then we also have a secondary group, which are innovators, investors, academics, researchers, NGOs, and change leaders. So there's two, we try and do either very much farmer focused articles or ones looking at people who are slightly more not so hands-on in the sector. Just a quick look at our stats. We have 2.3 users a year. We're read mainly, the biggest audiences are in the States, India, Southeast Asia, the UK, and Nigeria. And we're owned by a company called Hatch Blue, which invests in aquaculture startups that also intends to make the industry more sustainable. Do we cover issues of animal welfare? Yes, it's a regular theme on the Fish Site, and we regularly engage with with welfare advocacy groups. And we're also very interested in the science behind this, and the latest research coming out of the universities into fish and other aquatic animals sentience. And some of the companies we worked with or covered, you can see the logos there: WWF, FAI, Fish Welfare Initiative, RSPCA, Compassion and World Farming, Nature Conservancy, Humane Slaughter Association. So yes, we are very sort of interested in covering the welfare angle. But yes, just I have a sort of a few tips. They're rather general. A lot of them are based on common sense, but anyone looking to engage with the fish site on this topics, first of all, I would say use science, not subjectivity, to back up your arguments. Ethical arguments they're important, but if you can back them up with economics, then the farmers will sit up and take note. As the others have noted, follow the money. Can improve welfare grant access to farmers for new or more lucrative markets? Does better welfare reduce the incidence of disease and therefore production costs? And does better welfare improve the quality of your end product? Because there's lots of good science now showing that it really does. There's plenty of good hard economic reasons for farmers to raise their games. I think it's very important, to be prepared to get your hands dirty and work directly with farmers on the ground. I think Fish Welfare Initiative, who some of you might be familiar with, have done a great job there. They've decided to start concentrate on the carp farming sector in India, and they're engaging with India is the second biggest aquaculture producer in the world. Carps are the most widely farmed fish species, and so they've gone in there and they're speaking to farmers, they're interacting with them, and they're really putting in the hard yards. That's the sort of story that's that is very I think very inspiring for us and for our readers. Very important to understand, demonstrate you have a good understanding of the industry. If you don't, then don't be afraid to ask questions. I think being original is crucial. I think the others have touched on that in their talks as well. Aquaculture is hugely diverse. There's over 500 farmed aquatic species out there, and so there's also a huge number of opportunities to improve the sector, and any good stories to be told. And finally, yes, be positive and practical. Demonstrate that progress can be made, and it doesn't have to cost the earth to increase welfare standards, because there are so many little incremental things, particularly with technologies coming through, new technologies, new research, and there's a huge number of ways for farmers to improve their practices. And that is that's my very quick presentation.
Thank you, Rob, for that. It was very insightful. So now we're going to go to the questions and answers, and they'll last about 15 minutes. So the first question is for Tom, and it's about the Guardian's animal feed column. So the question is, should advocates pitch the General Guardian or to you directly? And what sort of pitches work best?
Should they pitch? So yeah, there's a with the Guardian. So where do stories about fish go? Well, they could go in a number of sections depending on what the story is. If for argument's sake, if it's a story of kind of global national significance, it could run on on the main news site. So whether that then you just pitch to the news editors, or you pitch to the country correspondent who is from the relevant country. So if there's a story about a fish farming in Egypt, then you pitch to the the Egypt correspondent, and that that's easy enough for you to find. And then if it's kind of a story that maybe isn't going to be on the front page, or something that you could tell that you'd maybe talk to your auntie about, is always the analogy we always got told at journalism school. If it's maybe a little bit below that, then I guess you might want to, and you think it's environmental, you might want to pitch the environment section. And if you're, whether you go to the animals farm section or environment, it's kind of each, they're kind of the same section in a sense, because we're part of environment really. So you could go to either. And I work for that section. So, you can pitch to anyone in environment or myself. So I hope that answers, but if the person there wants to ask a follow-up, then go ahead.
Great, thank you. I think that covered it. So the next question,
and sort of following up, just because I think it was Kenny was talking about what stories work. I mean, the key, it depends. For the Guardian, I guess the Guardian isn't fish news, is it? Or so it's not to cover a fish story, it has to really be the new part of news is really important. So it has to be something new, doesn't it? Something that is really worth telling something about, something that makes you want to tell other people about. If it's a story that's just, it can't just be important to you and your job and your sector. It has to be something of wider significance. And I do think that welfare issue is interesting, because most people don't go, no, I think hardly anyone, or no one I know anyway, has ever gone and bought high welfare fish. But for sure, there are some people out there that go and buy high welfare lamb or beef or chicken or whatever, and it's something they sort that, that's sought after. But that isn't the case with fish. They might look for some kind of label or some kind of other attributes, but not high welfare. So that is a story. How fish is produced is not really understood. The whole sector is it's kind of hidden. And the point Kenny was making about the companies, yeah, they are hidden as well. But it's interesting that some of the bigger players, I'm pretty sure Tyson has just made a big investment in aquaculture. Did they not buy an Australian company, or this? I'm sure it's one of those big players. So there is movement, there is growth, but it is really kind of a sector that's a bit hidden from the mainstream audience. Most people don't know anything about the industry. It's away from our eyes, and which is, I'm just calling it factory farm because, aquaculture is basically a factory, isn't it? So it is by their nature hidden away, unlike, sheep on the landscape, sheep on the hills or in the fields. So it is hidden, and it is disconnected from the public. And so it is an industry that for sure, it needs a light shone on it, for good or for bad, if that makes sense. So there are stories about that, and they don't always have to be bad stories as well. Like, for sure, there's the stories about welfare problems and about the reality of production issues like disease, etc. They're the stories you kind of get pitched at most. But there can also be good stories. What is a better way of farming fish? Tell us that story. What is an ideal, or what is a perfect system that you want people to buy into and support and champion? Because for sure, we don't want to just sort of have no fish industry. Lots of people love eating fish, so tell us the good, pitch a good story as well as the bad news, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's some really good points, and there's obviously some massive differences in how more pet animals are documented and stuff in the media, and also farm animals in general, and also fish. So I was wondering, in relation to that, have you seen any major differences in the general public's reaction to articles about fish, and then farm animals, and then other animals as well?
That's difficult, isn't it? You can see how well stories do, and stories we've done about fish having feelings, people are very curious about that. They have done well, but I don't know. If you think about, there were some stories, there have been occasional stories about sort of fish die-offs from problems, whatever it is, on farm or in certain fish farm systems, but maybe they wouldn't generate the traction or interest that a story about mass culling in animals does. For instance, there were a lot of stories around COVID times in the US and Europe, and more recently in the UK, about animals having to be euthanized, or I think they call it a welfare cull, but basically killed because of supply chain issues, or whatever, or disease. And in the case of TB, animals being killed, have to be culled for that, and those, or African swine fever, and those do generate interest. And I'm not sure we're quite there yet in terms of fish. So I think just, people don't have the same emotional attachment to fish that they do with animals, for reasons that are probably obvious to everyone, apart from people who love fish dearly. But fish, maybe we feel a little bit disconnected from, and there's lots of reasons for that. But it's an interesting area that I get the sense, because I suppose I've been doing farming stuff for a long time, that it just feels as a little bit different now. There's a little bit more interest in fish beyond just the normal environmental stories, about fish feed and about polluting of wild genetics. They're the sort of traditional fish stories that always get covered every so often, and the long-standing issues. But maybe there's a little bit, it seems like a new area that's kind of like, oh, what's this area? Fish welfare. This is kind of weird. This is a bit different. I still think there's a little bit of an appetite for that. because most people don't have any idea. And you kind of have, in terms of readers, like we all, we have to be told something, a couple of hundred times before it kind of registers, not because we're stupid, it's just because we're inundated with information all the time. So, we've heard information about factory farming and about cows indoors and, I don't know, bull calves, for instance, for so many years now that most people kind of, they know this issue, but I don't think that's that level of awareness about fish farming or about fish welfare or about issues in the industry. And the positive thing for the industry is that's an opportunity, isn't it? And that's why I say it's important to tell good stories too, because if you tell good stories, then that's an opportunity for the industry to develop that way. It provides an incentive for the market to move that way. If there's a consumer interest and eventually a market demand that follows to take the industry in a different direction. Otherwise, it will just go in the same direction, won't it?
Great, thank you for that insight. Next up, we have a question for Anna and Kenny, which is, why do some issues related to animal welfare get covered by some of the mainstream media outlets and others don't? And what is the topic you'd like to see covered relating to fish welfare? So there's two questions there. For Anna and Kenny, if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's literally the $1 million question, right? I think that the tips that everybody has given today, and the other panelists, the tips that I gave, are hopefully helpful. But I would say, carrying on from what Tom says, like following the trends, I think is really important. So yeah, looking at what has been covered, looking at what the conversations are, looking at how people are discussing certain issues and finding an angle and a story that's relevant now is a helpful one. We certainly did that a lot during COVID. We had a massive swell in articles and readership going in all different angles to do with COVID. But really what gets covered, at least to me, I'm sure Kenny will chip in as well, but to me what gets covered right now, it could literally be down to how overworked an editor is, or how many emails are in their inbox, or the mood of the person that day. Like, I would just say, whatever the stories and the narratives that you think are important, if you're trying to find the angles that are harnessing the news cycles, like, keep going and don't give up, and don't take it personally. And your next question was, what story do we think is not being covered now? Is that right? Yeah, I think that in terms of what we would like to see more of in mainstream media, we would like to see the conversation around the impact of animal agriculture on climate change. So we've done some studies at Sentient Media, and one of our reports showed that the impact of aviation was reported on up to 120 times more than the impact of animal agriculture, even though aviation has been said to cause about 2.5 to 5% of greenhouse gas emissions versus the 14.5% that we're accepting is probably a low estimate of the impact of animal agriculture. So to us at Sentient Media, it's one of our key areas of focus, is making sure that we're working on articles that are presenting the relationship between the climate crisis and industrial animal agriculture. And of course, that includes aquaculture as well.
Thank you. Kenny, did you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Anna nailed it when she said that's the $1 million question as to why does mainstream media cover some issues and doesn't cover others. And there's quite a lot of just luck or serendipity involved. Like Anna said, it depends on who the editor is. Maybe the editor is quite interested in fish welfare or plant-based food or what have you. Maybe the editor is more interested in some other part of the food system. So, and there's a lot of turnover in media. So if there's an editor or reporter covering your beat at a particular outlet this year, they might not be there next year. They might go somewhere else. So, but it's important to remember that everyone who's pitching stories is on the same level playing field generally, meaning that persistence and creativity are going to pay off a lot. And you kind of just have to accept that you can't really control how busy an editor or reporter is, or what their personal interests are, or what the editor-in-chief of a particular outlet wants to prioritize. But I think it's clear to see that over the last few years, more and more outlets have been covering animal agriculture in one way or another. And so I think interest is growing, the issue is becoming more legitimate, and more outlets are dedicating space to these issues. So I think the trend is positive, but you just have to be persistent and creative and patient. And then, sorry, what was the second question? Oh, what would you like to see more of? I will also echo Anna's statement in saying that I think a really undercovered area is the climate impact of animal ag. Stay tuned, we actually have an interesting piece on this coming up soon. And I know that the Guardian's environment section also does a lot of great coverage on climate and ag. But yeah, I think we're probably going to see that change over the coming years. As there's more and more climate coverage, there's probably going to be more climate and ag coverage. I've seen that change over the last couple of years. And again, I think that's going to continue as long as people continue to pitch stories and raise awareness on the issue.
Just to chip in, like for sure what Anna and Kenny agree with, it's just also bear in mind when you're pitching to a journalist that you're not just pitching to the journalist, you're also indirectly pitching to the editor above them. It's, you know, some people sort of think everything I write, effectively I've got to justify to someone else, and whoever I justify it to has to justify it to someone else, and eventually you get to the top, to the editor, who has to justify it to themselves every day why they're covering what they're covering. So there is pressure there. So it's always worth bearing in mind, you know, you want to give as juicy, as good a story to the journalist as possible, but also you want them to trust you in the long term. So if you sell them a dud story, then, you know, they lose a bit of faith because they don't want to look bad in the future with the people there. And that's particularly the case when you get a high turnover, as Kenny was alluding to, because that for sure is an issue in journalism. Like, I've stayed in the same sector for a while now, but lots of people move around, so they're maybe not as knowledgeable or know as other people do, and therefore, you know, if you can earn their trust, then that's useful in the long run, if that makes sense, rather than just, you know, one good story and then you lose them.
Yeah, thank you. Those are some really good points from the three of you. Next question is for Roberto, and it says, what allies in the media currently exist for the aquatic animal welfare movement?
Hi. Okay, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, sure, no worries. So what allies in the media currently exist for the aquatic animal welfare movement?
Okay, well, I would say definitely you'd want to focus on, there's definitely, like, for example, vegan media obviously are, of course, a big ally. The Economist ourselves, we could be a big ally, like I said, because we can always focus that on the growing plant-based seafood sector and cultivated fish sector. Also, other media outlets like plant-based news, of course. So those are going to be the biggest allies. With the others, you'd have to do a little bit more research, because some outlets, I get the feeling, don't cover it as much. And unfortunately, there also tends to be a little bit of there's sometimes like politics involved, like you know, some media outlets I feel that tend to lean more, you know, more right wing, tend to not cover animal welfare as much, and much less fish welfare, while those that tend to veer more to the left tend to be more open to that, to those kind of topics. But yes, I would say definitely, obviously, vegan media, and then there's obviously, you know, the other ones you'd have to research. Obviously, it seems like, for example, I'm happy that Vox is giving a lot of coverage to the animal welfare and fish welfare areas. I saw an article in the New York Times like less than a year ago, which they haven't covered much about fish, but they did write an article called "The End of Meat is Here." I believe that was the title of the article, which was an excellent article. So yeah, I would say like that, but yeah, it takes a little bit of research, but basically what I mentioned there.
Thank you. The next question is for anyone that would like to answer, and it is, how could the media not only report on what's of popular interest, while also informing the public of issues they should be concerned about?
I'll try for that one. So this is a really good question, and nice to see you, Mary. I think we met at a conference a while ago. So I think, at least at Vox and Future Perfect, we have a bit of a unique mandate because we're mostly grant funded. So that gives us a lot of room to not just focus on what do we think is going to get a lot of traffic, but what do we think are the most important stories to tell? Which is why, earlier this year, I got to write a piece on the emerging fish welfare movement, which, doesn't appeal to a mass audience, but I think, and my editor thought was a really important story to tell. But not every outlet has that ability to focus on stories purely that they think are both really important and could interest readers. A lot of times editors have to weigh that balance of what do we think is important and newsworthy and what will people click on. And that's a hard decision to make. So yeah, I'm grateful that at Vox, because we're mostly grant funded, we can be more selective in what we cover and put out things that we think are neglected and other outlets aren't going to cover. But a lot of outlets kind of don't have that choice necessarily and need to make sure that if they're going to put a lot of resources into a story, that it generates traffic. I don't know if Tom or Anne have any, or Roberto have anything to add to that.
I'm not sure. I mean, a good story is a good story, isn't it? There's a difference, isn't it? I know what you're saying. Some important stories, maybe people don't realize how important they are. And that's what good journalism is, isn't it? Following a story and turning it into news when no one else saw it was news, and then everyone will follow. But that's, for most stories aren't, that's quite a big ask. If you've got that important a story, I suppose you've got to think, is it that most of the time the stories being pitched aren't really that significant, if that makes sense, unless you're uncovering some some scandal, something that is never known before. Most of the time the stories are of interest, but not necessarily something that we all need to stop our work for or stop cooking dinner for and sort of take of note. And I guess that's the difference, isn't it? And that's what I suppose for national media, they've always got to think, because there is personally speaking, like, there is too much news out there. That's my perspective. And The Guardian, I think in some ways, we often have conversations internally, there is kind of produces too much. So in a way, I feel like we should sort of think more about what we're producing and not just produce things just because we feel we should produce news, if that makes sense. And The Guardian has less pressure, or I don't feel pressure to sort of do things that people click on. You just got to do stuff that is actually newsworthy, really, really newsworthy, and something that, we should be taking up people's time with. Because, it does take a lot of time. If everyone was to read every story The Guardian produced, I mean, that would take up most of their day, I think. So I think it is worth thinking that when you're pitching, because you're taking up your time to pitch, but you're also taking up the journalist's time to read. So it's always worth thinking, it's worth testing almost. What's the word? Not testing, but sort of sense checking with someone unconnected to the fish industry. Like I say, if you've got an auntie or uncle or a granny, grandpa, or a brother, sister, or a partner who's unconnected, tell them, and if they don't sort of switch off and ask you about a completely different topic, then maybe you've got a story there, if that makes sense. When you're talking to national, it's different if you're talking to other media, maybe who have a role to cover everything in the fish industry or whatever. But I think if you're talking to national media, it's got to be something that is really something that people will tell other people about and isn't just of internal significance, but it's something beyond the industry.
Thanks for that input as well. We're running out of time, so we've just got one more question. This question is for Rob. What are some upcoming technologies that have been featured in the fish site, and are there any ones that you're specifically interested in, and are there any that have impact on fish welfare?
It's a very good question. I mean, yeah, it's probably not something that a lot of people want to talk about, but some of the biggest problems relating to fish welfare are relating to killing the fish. So actually some of the new devices coming through to in a lot of countries, if fish farmers want to kill the fish, they just haul them out of the pond, put them aside, and they'll asphyxiate in the air. So that is a pretty unpleasant way to die. So one of the big areas of fish welfare, one of the big gaps is to do with welfare at slaughter. And there is an increasing range of new machinery for killing fish humanely and quickly. So that's one big area. There's also looking at genetics and breeding programs. That's having some big advances in terms of making fish more resistant to various diseases. There's gene editing is being used increasingly. Admittedly, just in the lab, it's not being used in the field, but that's going to have some big potential to protect fish against a range of diseases. So yeah, there's quite a wide range of research going on in terms of new tech for improving fish welfare.
Thanks, Rob. And that's about all that we have time for. I'd just like to thank all of the panelists and the audience for joining. I think it was a really interesting, insightful panel discussion. Also, if any of the panelists would like to share their emails, then please comment them in the chat. And to keep up to date, you can check out our website at la.fish, but also check out our social media. Also, we're using this app called Rover. So if anyone would like to network, we're using that at the moment as well. The next session will be starting in about 14 minutes. So please have a break. And just a reminder that session is going to be in Spanish. So we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thanks again to all the panelists. It's been a really insightful event. Bye-bye.